In 2014, Barking, a quiet area in East London, was not known for serious crime. It was a residential neighborhood with parks, apartment buildings, and familiar routines. When a young man was found unresponsive near a local cemetery, authorities believed it was a tragic but isolated incident. The cause appeared simple: an overdose. There were no signs of a struggle, no witnesses, no immediate reason to suspect anything more. The case was recorded, closed, and quickly forgotten. Then it happened again. Another young man was found in the same general area. Same circumstances, same conclusion. Once again, authorities believed it was an unfortunate personal tragedy. Two separate cases. No connection. But there was a connection. No one was looking for it yet. The men who were found had one thing in common. Shortly before their deaths, they had met someone new. A man who lived nearby. A man who appeared friendly, quiet, and unremarkable. His name was Stephen Port. Stephen lived alone in an apartment close to the cemetery where the first body had been found. He spent much of his time online, using dating apps and messaging platforms to meet people. To those who spoke with him, he seemed shy, sometimes awkward, but polite. No one considered him dangerous. In early 2015, a third man was found. This time, the location was impossible to ignore. Once again, near the same cemetery. Once again, the initial conclusion pointed toward substance use. But something about the repetition raised quiet concerns. 3 young men, same area, same outcome. Still, no formal link was made. Families began asking questions. They noticed inconsistencies. Messages sent from their loved ones' phones after they should have been unresponsive. Strange texts that didn't sound like them. Plans that made no sense. But their concerns were dismissed. Authorities believed they were seeing coincidence. Stephen Port continued living his life. He continued meeting people online. He continued inviting them to his apartment. And he continued walking through the neighborhood unnoticed. Then came the 4th case. This time, something changed. The pattern was no longer subtle. For young men, same area, same method, same timeline. And now, the public began to notice what investigators had missed. These were not accidents. They were connected. And the person connecting them was closer than anyone realized. As the 4th case drew attention, investigators were forced to look back at what they had previously dismissed. The similarities were no longer easy to ignore. Each of the young men had been found unresponsive in or near the same cemetery. Each case had initially been labeled as an overdose. And in every situation, there were unexplained details that had been overlooked. When police re-examined phone records, a disturbing pattern appeared. In multiple cases, messages had been sent from the victims' phones after they were already unresponsive. These messages claimed the person was safe or with friends. Families insisted the wording didn't sound right. It was too formal, too calm, almost scripted. Investigators traced the messages. All of them led back to the same contact, Stephen Port. Further analysis showed that each victim had met Port shortly before their death, usually through dating apps. Conversations revealed a similar approach every time. Friendly introductions, quick trust, invitations to meet privately. Port presented himself as harmless and welcoming. There was no obvious reason to be suspicious. Inside his apartment, however, investigators began to uncover the truth. Digital records showed repeated searches related to substances and dosages. There were messages discussing control, trust, and secrecy. Port had been methodical. He used the same approach again and again, confident that authorities would continue to treat each case as an isolated event. The 2nd and 3rd victims' timelines were laid out side by side. Both had met Port late in the evening. Both had traveled to his apartment. Both had stopped responding to messages shortly afterward. And both were later found in the same area near the cemetery. Still, no one had intervened. What finally shifted the investigation was the 4th case. This time, the victim's family refused to accept the official explanation. They pushed for toxicology reports to be reviewed again. They demanded access to phone data. Their persistence forced authorities to reopen all 4 cases as a single investigation. Once combined, the pattern was undeniable. For men, 1 location, 1 contact, 1 repeating method. Police placed Stephen Port under surveillance. His online activity was monitored. His apartment was searched. Evidence that had once seemed insignificant now told a clear story when viewed together. Port was arrested. During questioning, he denied responsibility at first. He claimed the meetings were consensual. He insisted the outcomes were accidents. But the digital trail told a different story, one of planning, repetition, and control. The case was no longer about coincidence. It was about a serial offender who had relied on invisibility. And now that invisibility was gone. Once Stephen Port was arrested, the investigation moved quickly. What had once looked like separate, tragic incidents was now clearly a single, connected series of events. Investigators reconstructed each case in detail, placing them side by side to reveal how methodical and deliberate the actions had been. During questioning, Port continued to deny responsibility. He claimed that the meetings were voluntary and that nothing had been planned. According to him, everything that happened was accidental. But the evidence told a very different story. Digital data became the strongest element of the case. Messages sent from the victims' phones after they were already unresponsive were traced directly back to Port's device. Internet searches showed repeated attempts to calculate effects and timing. Conversations revealed the same phrases, the same reassurances, and the same promises used again and again. It was no longer possible to argue coincidence. Investigators also uncovered evidence that Port had returned to the same cemetery repeatedly, even when he had no reason to be there. The location was not random. It was familiar, secluded, and consistent. Each detail reinforced the same conclusion. This was a pattern. When the case went to court, the prosecution laid out the timeline step by step. They showed how each victim had met Port online, how trust was established quickly, how meetings took place in private, and how the outcomes followed the same sequence every time. Families of the victims listened as the similarities were explained in full. For many of them, this was the first time their concerns had been taken seriously. The realization was painful, but it also brought clarity. What had happened to their loved ones was not an accident. It was part of a deliberate series of acts. Port's defense argued that there was no direct witness to the events inside his apartment, but the court focused on the totality of evidence. The repeated behavior, the digital trail, the identical circumstances, and the messages sent after the fact formed a complete picture. In 2016, the verdict was delivered. Stephen Port was found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with no possibility of release. The judge described his actions as calculated and predatory, emphasizing that the repetition was what made the case undeniable. This was not a single tragic mistake. It was a series of intentional decisions. The Stephen Port case is remembered not just for what happened, but for how long it took to see the truth. For lives were lost before the pattern was recognized. Once the outcome was clear and final. There were no unanswered questions in the end. No mystery about responsibility. No uncertainty about the sequence of events. Just a clear conclusion. A serial offender. A repeated method. And a case that was finally, definitively closed. If you want to hear more dark and mysterious true crime stories, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.